one of the questions that we continually get here is, and it's really variations on the same thing, and it's this question of how do we live faithful Christian lives in the midst of sexual revolution, where the ground seems to be shifting beneath us, and values and facts that we took for granted are no longer part of the mix, and we're expected to just sort of knuckle under and accept this new way of looking at the world. We got a couple of questions here. I'm kind of just going to summarize these two because the answers are going to be very similar. But we got a question from this woman who's writing in, asking for advice for her husband, who is actually a vice president of human resources at a hospital, and they've got a self-funded insurance plan that does not cover sex reassignment surgery. But a mother has requested this surgery for her 17-year-old daughter, who thinks she's a boy. And the insurance company actually denied the request, and her husband has also denied the request. But this mother is continuing to make her case. And now she has a bunch of different doctors and psychiatrists backing her and saying that her daughter needs to transition to being expressing herself as a boy and get medical intervention of some kind. And this woman's husband, as a VP of human resources at a hospital, is continuing to deny the request and feels he cannot in good conscience accept it, that it would be a dereliction of duty to approve it and then go through with this grave set of changes in this young woman's life. We had another person who wrote in, who's actually an officer in the Air Force and an evangelical Christian, who says, seeking to live faithfully in my work and life, and looking back on a very difficult decision that was made in that time, where this person had to approve request for waivers for the Air Force annual fitness assessment, basically accommodating or deciding not to accommodate transgender individuals. And I think the decision made in this case was that this person would just process the waivers because he wasn't the one making the decisions in the first place. That was the higher ups. But he's asking, did I do the right thing? Did I compromise my values by approving these waivers on an administrative level and allowing people to basically set aside the requirements for pull-ups or push-ups or running or whatever in the Air Force because they were transgender, to accommodate that new orthodoxy? So these are two different sides of a very similar question, and I'm really curious to see how we can talk through this and figure out the different dimensions, because you and I have both given advice that, in some cases Christians ought to stand up and say, no, I can't participate in this. And in other cases, there may be other ways. So, John, what do we think about these two cases?
Well, a couple things come to mind right off the bat. The first one is listeners might be thinking, why do you guys answer the same question every week? And the
Mm.
answer is,
We
we
get the
get
same
this
question
question
every
every
week.
week. And
Right.
we've gotten it from such a variety of people in such a variety of situations, from students to educators, to medical professionals, to HR people, and in large companies. In this case, actually, HR at a hospital, to military folks, and it goes back, really, it circles back to the conversations you never thought you'd have with your kids. I remember the morning after the Obergefell decision mandated same-sex marriage on America, I sat down with my three daughters. They were the only three kids we had at the time, and we talked through it. And afterwards, Sarah and I were talking and thought, it wasn't in our parenting plan to have a conversation about same-sex marriage with our then 6-year-old. But as N.T. Wright once said, you don't always get to choose what you talk about, as Christians, or what you care about as Christians. And so we're getting this question literally a couple times a week. I was on a broadcast with the church just a few weeks ago and got this or just a few days ago, and I got this same question. And I mentioned that we're hearing just almost every week from someone who's kind of facing this crisis of conscience. And it goes to our kids, which is, if we're not having these conversations with our kids, we need to, because the practice that we have at home needs to be up to snuff for the competition they're going to face in life. There's a passage in one of the prophets where in the Old Testament where he says, look, if you can't, you know, if you can't race with men, how are you going to run with the horses?
Mm.
In other words, if you don't practice adequately here on the questions around the dinner table and so on, how is that going to happen? It just has to change what we prepare our kids for. Um, and that's something that's kind of driving the conversations that we're having around our table and that Sarah and I are talking about. And so parents are just going to have some of these conversations with their kids, as uncomfortable as it is. The second thing is, you know, just because we're getting so many of these questions from so many different angles, um, it's just a recalibration for the church. I mean, what's faithfulness look like? I mean, Christians in other countries and other cultures and other moments have had to wrestle with, where's the line? What's the line of my conscience? How do I think through to render to Caesar what's Caesar, to render to God what's God, and not to get those two things mixed up? And this is we've had moments where faith and culture have collided in our lifetimes, but never to this degree. And of course, we all felt that at the end of over the last several years accelerate. And it feels like in many ways that it's accelerating again. I was asked the other day, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, are people going to look back, particularly at the T in the LGBTQ, and say, what were we thinking? Where we actually did harm to little children, we actually
Mm.
harmed little boys and little girls, and or is this going to be the new normal? And I would say, this is one of those things where we're trying to defy gravity and it's not going to end well. And there's going to be an awful lot of victims. That said, I think with these two questions, there's a real difference between the situations that these two people are put in.
Yeah, agreed.
The first one was asked really to basically pay for an unnecessary surgical procedure that would end up removing or mutilating a perfectly healthy body part at
Mhm.
an institution that is designed to help people heal. This would be a surgery that is harming, not healing. Not just because this person is quote unquote a Christian or somebody believes. Basically, you're
Mhm.
looking at something where the medical and scientific community are completely capitulating by and large to an ideology that has we don't know where this is going. What we know is that in every situation where the mind and the body are misaligned, we try to align the mind with the body.
Right.
Or when physical reality and one's kind of emotional inner perspective are misaligned, we try to conform the mental perspective with what is observable, true, real, testable, and so on.
Yeah.
And this is exactly the opposite case. And I can't think of another case at all where we try to align the body with the mind as opposed to the mind with the body.
Yeah.
And for a health institution, a hospital to do this, this seems to me to be a line that someone ought not cross. In the second case, it was really someone doing paperwork, processing requests for exceptions to military policy and passing those requests up the chain.
Mhm.
The request made by someone else. I'm sure that in a job like this particular officer, executive EO for a high-ranking officer, probably got some other wacky requests, from enlisted folks and maybe from officers asking for exceptions, and basically looking at it going, this is crazy, but still passing it up. I don't find that one's morally guilty for doing his job unless he put a post-it note on the top of it and said, this seems like a great idea or something like that, which clearly
Yeah.
this guy didn't do. That seems to me to be a different thing. And this same kind of third option, Shane, is what Jack Phillips has dealt with,
Mhm.
Baronel Stutzman has dealt with, which is, look, you're being asked to violate your conscience.
Mhm.
Uh, don't do that, but also don't dehumanize someone else. Someone has, in this case, for example, someone making the request has every right within their job responsibility to make the request. To facilitate that request is actually to honor the responsibility that this person has, as well as the right that the requester has. So that doesn't seem to me to be a violation of conscience. Now, if this guy is the high ranking officer making the decision,
Right.
now we're kind of back into the category of the first questioner. But these, I guess the thing that keeps getting me, Shane, is that these are the sorts of ethical considerations that are going to be increasingly common, that you and I are going to have to make, and that many of our listeners are going to have. This isn't like, man, did you hear what happened all the way over in the other side of the country? This is
Mhm.
right in our own backyards and probably in our own job descriptions at some point in the near future.
It really is. It really does put the lie to the idea we heard again and again a few years ago that this sort of thing is not going to affect you or your life. If you could just let people live the way they want to live and accept their identity and leave them alone and stop trying to lord your morality over them or impose it on them from on high, then we would all just get along and have a great life. But it turns out when you redefine reality or aspects of the human person, that has effects down the road. It actually changes the way people have to do their jobs and live their lives and build their restrooms and do surgery and do paperwork and everything else that flows out of that gender distinction that's built into nature. And so if you want to deny an aspect of nature, you're going to have a big remainder at the end. And it's going to be all the people who aren't ready to go along with that and deny an aspect of nature. When you were talking about this issue of try to bring the physical reality into conformity with the felt identity, I was reminded again of Douglas Murray's The Madness of Crowds. His chapter on the transgender movement, it's just called Trans. It's the best thing I've ever read on the subject, because he is writing from the perspective of someone who self-identifies as gay. He's in the LGBT movement, right? But he's also extremely critical of it and careful. He has a great deal of misgivings about the claims that are being made, particularly when it comes to the T. And he says, "Look, I'm not trying to deny the experience of anyone who has gender dysphoric and believes that they were born in the wrong body or whatever, or feels that way and hasn't made peace with it. What I am saying is that we don't know anything about it scientifically at this point, and to be cutting people's body parts off and demanding that everyone else go along with it as if it's legitimate, necessary medical practice is idiotic and crazy. And there will come a time in the not too distant future," he says, "when people are going to look back on this and go, what on earth were they thinking?" It's going to be they're going to look back on it with the same revulsion and confusion with which we look back on practices like bloodletting, that just make no medical sense and ended up harming people. Except in this case, we know the physical facts. We know the medical facts that bodies are meant to work in a certain way and that cutting out healthy tissue doesn't cure any physical ailment. It's pure ideology asserting itself over the medical profession in the first case and the military in the second case. I agree with your assessment as well that we're looking at two different things here. We're looking at someone who actually has a causal, determining influence over the situation, which is the person who has to decide whether to the VP of HR who has to decide whether to pay for a surgery, and someone who's just literally doing paperwork for decisions that are made by someone else. I don't see a moral obligation in the second case with the Air Force. Um, to actually resist. Now, I do recognize that at some point you do get into that category of, remember the Nuremberg trials where the Allies were saying, were trying the Nazi officials and saying, "Why did you do this?" And they said their defense was, "I was just following orders. I'm just doing what I was told." At some point, that defense does wear out, and I think it's precisely at the point where you're making determinations that hurt people. In this case, I don't see that there's a determination being made. Definitely, though, in the first case, where, I mean, look, if this to me is unquestionably a moment where a Christian has to take a stand, and I say, well done for taking that stand, for refusing to approve those surgeries. Even though you're an administrative official in a hospital, you're keeping the Hippocratic oath better than the people who are pushing for the surgery. There's something, and there's something kind of Kantian about this, that you should be doing what you want everyone else to do, what would be right for everyone else to do, and what would make a better world if everyone else did it. And ultimately, the people who are going to break the spiral of silence on this mutilation and malpractice are going to be doctors and medical officials who just put their foot down and say, no, I'm not going to do it. And that may cost them jobs. And God bless them for being willing to make that stand, because that could save lives in the end.
So yeah, and I think that brings up kind of, just to give people, because I'm sure we're going to get another email about this next week, right? I mean, we're getting so many. So 3 things to keep in mind. Okay. 3 things to keep in mind. Number one is a theology of being fired. Look, it's not something we've really had to prioritize, but it is something that almost every generation of Christians throughout the history of the church has had to prioritize. And Jesus told parables about it, and that is counting the cost. I've been calling it for a couple of years a theology of getting fired. And part of that is trusting the Lord with our livelihood, and all of that. And part of that too is for pastors and for churches to have a theology of somebody else being fired in their midst. In other words, like the early church surrounded the families of those who lost their lives or lost their freedoms, we need to be prepared to do the same thing. We need to surround the Jack Phillips and the Baron L. Stutzmans and the VP of Human Resources at a hospital like this guy. We need to have that theology of getting fired. We need to think about it personally. We need to think about it collectively. The second thing is what might be called the Daniel option. And Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is evidence of somebody brought into a pagan land, forced to violate their conscience,
Given a really bad choice.
given a binary, right? Which
Yeah.
is, eat this meat or die. And they're like, I think there's a third option. And there's not always a third option. Let's
Is
be
there a
clear.
vegetable menu?
There's not always a third option, but sometimes there is. And I think that needs to be, worked through. And you know what, Pastor, if you're listening to this, your parishioner is going to need your help to think that through.
Hmm.
Um, you know, far too many pastors in my mind are like, well, when they force me to perform a same-sex wedding, no way. If you get to draw a line in your vocation, your parishioner gets to draw a line in his. And we need each other to know where those lines are.
Yeah.
The third thing that I'll say is, in fact, I actually sent the question, and hopefully this person is listening. I sent this question from the VP of Human Resources at the hospital, who's actually making this decision and feels like they're going to lose their job, to our friends at the Alliance Defending Freedom. And they immediately said, have them call me. So hopefully we've already reached out and let them know. But if you're hearing this from the first time, the Alliance Defending Freedom, they're looking for this. Now, some people don't, one of the things I appreciate about ADF is that they're not winning to win. They're winning to do what's right. They're not just looking for cases that are high profile. They're looking for cases that set good jurisprudence so that religious liberty is protected and restored in the American context, not just kind of serving my own needs and everybody, we good, that side bad. And you need to keep ADF on speed dial if this is you and some others. So those are 3 things that I think can be hard, tangible steps that we take in order to, evaluate situations like this.